Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Insley. I'm the team lead for Viz and Analysis here at the ALCF. Silvio Rizzi is here with me. He's going to help present. Janet Knowles and Victor Medavizzi are also part of our team. They're not here today, but I just wanted to acknowledge them and the work that they do. So here's the plan of what I'm going to talk about over the next hour or so. And this is going to be relatively high level. So if you're familiar with visualization, a lot of this is going to be familiar to you. But we do have a hands-on session, breakout sessions planned for this afternoon. And so I'll say a little bit about some of the things that we could potentially do there at the end. So we'll talk about some different types of examples of visualizations. If you came on the VizLab tour yesterday, you saw some of those already, or I guess it was on Wednesday, Tuesday. We'll talk some about different visualization tools and some data formats. I'll spend a considerable chunk of time on different types of data representation. So how you might think about getting insight out of your data through different types of representations. Talk a little bit about using visualization aside from the pretty pictures aspect and looking at using it for debugging, for example. Talk a little bit about some advanced rendering things that we've worked on that we could potentially be sharing with you. And then I'm going to hand things over to Silvio, and he's going to talk a while about aspects of in situ viz and analysis, which, if you're not familiar, basically, as you know, as our resources continue to scale, the size of the data that we're computing continues to grow. The rate that we can save that data, the rate we compute it, is outpacing the rate at which we can save it. So there's this discrepancy, and so there's been a lot of effort in the community to do in situ visualization, which is essentially doing viz and analysis on that data while it's still in memory before it gets thrown away, since we can't write it all to the file system. Of course, we're hoping that Deos, that Kevin just talked about, is going to help in narrow that gap, but there'll still be some need for in situ. And then again, we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do this afternoon. So here's just a few examples of some of the science teams that we've worked with. This is an example of a stellar radiation simulation. Again, if you came to the demos the other day in the VizLab, you may have seen this one. This is essentially an exploding star, and they're looking at how these massive stars, they're on the scale of 80 times the size of the sun, and they have this enormous amounts of gravity, yet they still lose mass. And so part of their research is to understand how that happens. This is an example that comes from a visualization example. It comes from an animation we did for them, and also accompanied one of their papers that was. The image ended up on the cover of Nature, which was a big, exciting for us. So this is an example of blood flow. This comes from one of our early science program, Aurora early science projects. This is Amanda Randall's team, looking at, in particular, how metastasis happens, where cancer cells move through the bloodstream. And so they're doing large-scale simulations of ultimately targeting the entire human body and looking at how cancer cells can get distributed through the bloodstream. And we've been working with them on not only porting things on the computation side, porting to Aurora, but also looking at enabling in situ visualization that I mentioned along with that. This is a computational fluid dynamics visualization, and this is an example of what I'll talk a little bit about more later, where we're trying to couple more advanced rendering techniques and couple it with scientific visualization in order to help give context, right? So, for example, here we have this bus that has this flow moving through it, and if we just show the science, the domain of the science data, right? You just get this big, cube with flowing, flow lines and things moving in it, but you lose the context, right? And so in particular, for trying to communicate data with lay audiences and beyond just the science team, having some context is helpful. And so we've been working to sort of improve things in that space. So this is an example of that. This is another, and I'll talk a little bit more about this one, specifically when I talk about some of our advanced rendering pipeline that we've been working with. Again, here we're coupling animation and rendering packages, 3D modeling packages with scientific data packages that we typically use to bring the science data into a more cinematic type view. And this particular example is looking at combustion engines. So we work with lots of teams that do material science and molecular visualization. And so these are just a couple of examples of things that come from that space. You may recognize, again, if you came on the tour earlier this week, you may recognize the image on the right that comes from a super lubricity simulation where they're looking at how to reduce friction between different components. So a little bit about, switch gears a little bit, about tools and data formats. So in terms of tools, there's all sorts of visualization applications out there. So a couple of ones that I highlight here, Visit and Pair Review are, and I'll speak more about them in a second, are sort of general purpose visualization tools, specifically for doing, enabled for doing distributed and parallel visualization. I highlight those both. So I didn't specifically talk about Viz resources, but so our existing resource is Cooley, which will be, is going to be retired at the end of this year, but it's still currently available. And so all the things that I highlight here in blue are available on Cooley. We're in the process of transitioning all of our Viz workloads to Polaris. And so we're still in the process of getting tools ready for production there. But we do have Visit and Pair View there, ImageMagick, FFmpeg, which are utilities for other visualization type utilities. So FFmpeg is an encoder that you can use to generate a stack of frames, and then you can use FFmpeg to encode them into a movie. ImageMagick is a command line tool for manipulating images, doing annotations and other effects like that. So in addition to these, the general purpose Viz applications like Visit, Pair Review, Insight. Insight is a commercial tool, which we don't have installed here, but it is a tool that's used widely in the community. There are other tools that are more domain specific, like VMD, Pymol, Oviedo. Those are all molecular dynamics type visualization tools. Vapor is one that's really geared towards environmental data. And then of course there's APIs that a lot of these tools are built on top of, like VTK, which is the visualization toolkit. So Visit and Pair Review, and so just to sort of compare them a little bit to VTK, as I mentioned, most of the Visit and Pair Review are largely built on top of VTK, but they're general purpose visualization applications. So they're largely GUI based, right? So you have some user interface that you use to manipulate your data and build pipelines. They both have a client server model, right? So it supports remote visualization. So typically we would run a server for either Visit or Pair Review on Cooley or Polaris. We could run it in parallel across multiple nodes, multiple GPUs of those resources. And then you would have a lightweight client that you run on your laptop or local workstation that connects to the to the server that's doing all the heavy lifting of reading the data from disk or and then performing the visualization algorithms that are essentially changing the data into pixels, do all the rendering there, and then essentially ship the results to your local desktop or client. They're both scriptable and extendable. So our team has built plugins for ParaView, for example, for reading specific types of data sets that weren't initially supported. Scriptable in that they both have a Python interface. And so largely what we tend to do is build up our pipeline using the GUI, and then we can save that as a Python script that we can then go off and run in batch mode and generate animations and series of images rather than have to be connected and have a human in the loop while it's doing that compute. And that's among the things we could potentially talk about this afternoon. I mentioned they're largely built on top of VTK, and they also have in situ capabilities. And again, I mentioned a little bit about what that is, and Silvio will talk about that more. VTK is more of an API programming environment. Again, that's the visualization toolkit. Has additional capabilities and some finer control over things that the other tools may not provide natively. Again, you could potentially use VTK to build plugins that you then use with these other tools. Has a smaller memory footprint, but it does require more expertise to use those than to essentially just use the GUI part of the tools. Largely that's for building either custom applications or, again, plugins for these other tools. So I mentioned data formats, so I'll just talk very briefly. This is not by any means an exhaustive list, but a list of some of the data types that these tools natively understand. There's lots more. And so chances are the simulation code that you're working with already has a data format that these tools understand. If not, you can build plugins, or there's utilities for, we spend a lot of our time doing data wrangling, right? Taking data from the format that's used for the simulation, which is often, in order to get best use of the resources, it's formatted to take advantage of the hardware that it's running on. That format is often very different from, or at least different from the data the format it needs to be in order to visualize it. And so there's some conversion that needs to happen. And so some of that can be done through utilities, or some of the in situ tools we talk about have methods for doing that as well. I'll just give one example for if you're using HDF5 as your data format. There's another library called XDMF, which basically is an XML wrapper around HDF5, so that you can describe in XML what your data layout is in order to enable the Viz tools to understand how to unpack the data that's in HDF. So I'll spend a bulk of time here talking about different types of data representations, right? So how do we take the data that we have and put it into some representation that we can look at? So one of the most basic ones is just cutting planes, right? And so this is basically what it sounds like. It's a plane or a slice that cuts through the data, right? And generally this is something that's grid-based. So if you have particle data, that slice is not generally going to work for that. But if you have something that's on either a regular or unstructured grid, you cut a plane through it, and then you apply a color table essentially to some scalar field that's on that, or vector field that's on that plane. So here's are just a few examples. Visit and ParaView, VTK, all very good at this. VMD, which I mentioned is more of a molecular dynamics tool, has some similar capabilities for some data formats. So here's a number of examples of volume rendering. And so what this basically is taking a 3D data set and making some 2D representation of it. And so there's a number of different algorithms and ways for doing this, for computing that. But one of the most, and there's a trade-off in terms of performance versus accuracy. And so, there's, like I said, there's different algorithms for doing that, but there's a lot of tools now that Visit and Pair View have some advanced capabilities that have very performant volume rendering capabilities. And so what this is essentially is you cast rays through a volume, take samples along those rays where it intersects with your grid, and for various values, you have a lookup table that says, here's the range of values, how do I map those values to a range of colors and transparency? So for example, if you look at our little mouse friend there's ranges of values that I know are, and this is density value, so in this particular case, right? And so I know there's a range of density values that represent bone, another range of values that represent muscle, cartilage, what have you. And so I can assign different ranges of different colors to those different ranges of data to identify different types of structures. In the case of the image in the lower right, I believe there we're looking at temperature, right? And so we're looking at looking at we're mapping the values to ranges of temperatures. So contours or isosurfaces, well, so in 3D it would be an isosurface, in 2D it would be an isoline. And this is essentially where it's representing a constant value throughout a data set, right? And so, for example, in the lower left, we have 4 different surfaces where each surface represents a different temperature. And so we're coloring each of them differently based on those same values. Alternatively, if you have multiple fields in your data set, you can generate a surface based on one and then color it by another. So for example, in the upper right, we're looking at, I believe it's vorticity is the surface, and then I honestly forget at this point if it's temperature or there's some other value that's being projected onto that surface. So you can represent multiple fields with a single representation, right? And that's largely what data visualization is about, is taking graphical attributes and assigning them to attributes of your data, right? And so representing different attributes of the data through different types of representations. Again, mapping this to the tools, Visit and Pair View are very good at this. VTK again is good, but does require some additional effort. So glyphs is essentially representing point data, right? And so if I have a 2D or 3D geometric object and I use that to represent this point data, and so the location is dictated by the coordinate, and then so its position or location on a 3D mesh or in 2D on a table or graph, for example. And then again, we take these graphical attributes and map them to the data attributes. So for example, color, size, orientation, right? And so in the image in the middle there, we're mapping, the arrows are pointing in the direction of the velocity, and then the color and the scale are also dictated by the magnitude of that velocity. In the image on the lower right, there we're just using color to differentiate either the types of atoms or their state. So again, mapping this color to attributes in the data. So streamlines, essentially, this is a way of representing a vector field that's on a mesh, right? So you need connectivity in order to generate streamlines. And what it's doing in this case is it's showing the direction that an element would travel at any point at a single point in time, right? So within a single time step, I'm saying I place a bunch of seed points into my mesh, look at the vector field there, where do those things point, follow that vector along and see where it would land within the same time step, and then follow it, from one step to the next, or within the same time step. And you would iterate over that some number of times within a single time step and generate these lines that shows the path that either velocity or some other vector field would cause these the particles to move. So next sort of extension of that is path lines, which is more or less the same thing, but now we're doing it over time rather than within a single time step, right? And so we're injecting particles and saying, okay, where is this particle going to end up at the next time step? And so then I move it to that position. And then based on the new time step and its new value and that new location, now where would it go? And so I follow that along over time. So again, we do work with molecular data sets. And so in this case, you might consider a tool that's more domain specific, like VMD or Vito. And they have lots of domain specific representations. Again, leverage many different types of file formats, capable of doing animation, and they're scriptable as well. Visit and ParaView have limited support for molecular data. I mean, they've over time they've added additional capabilities, but still maybe lack some of the specific types of domain-specific representations, like ribbons and such that I mentioned. But those are improving all the time. And again, VTK, anything's possible if you try hard enough. All right, so how are we doing on time? Okay. So talk a little bit about, so those are sort of examples of how you're going to represent the data that you're computing to getting insight from it, or communicate it to a larger audience. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk more about other ways that you potentially could use visualization, right? So this is an example where we're looking at, these are two propellers in a fluid dynamics simulation where there's the fluid is moving from right to left. And they had some instability in their simulation and they didn't understand what was happening. So I helped them through visualization. And so these are the two propellers. And you'll see they're going to rotate in opposite directions. And you keep your eye on the propeller on the right. Right. So at some point, it disappeared. So there was some bug in their code where they were not reinitializing something. And so one of the propellers went away, right? And so obviously without that physical barrier in there, they were getting much different results than they were expecting. And so by helping them through visualizing the data, they were able to understand that, oh, that's what's happening. The propeller went away. They were able to debug the code, figure out why. And so now this is the results they were expecting. You can kind of see underneath there, the propellers are in white, but they're covered by these vortices. And so these vortices structures that are forming here is what they were expecting to see, but weren't when they before we realized what was happening there. This is an example of using it for diagnostics, using visualization for diagnostics. So this is a volume renderer that we had, a homegrown volume renderer that we had written. And We wanted to try and improve performance, so we were looking at threading the code, and we wanted to understand what's the best way, right? You can lay out your memory in many different ways, and so this is an image of what the data looks like when, I mentioned volume rendering, right? So you look up a data value and you assign it a color based on the value that it finds. And this is an example of that. But instead, what we did was, instead of coloring it by the data, we colored it by the thread ID of the thread that was computing on the data, right? And depending on how we did the memory layout, it was assigned differently across the threads. Now, I don't remember off the top of my head which one of these was the most performant, but this enabled us to understand how that data was distributed across the threads in order to be able to improve our performance. And so that's just another example of using visualization in maybe a less traditional, not necessarily interested in the pretty picture at the end, but using it for understanding what's happening in our code. All right, so I mentioned advanced rendering, and so again, the Intel One API, which you've probably been hearing a lot about, is this interface for that Intel is pushing for, is developing and pushing for, leveraging a single API across different architectures. And so, part of that is the rendering toolkit or render kit, and so it's an open source framework for doing advanced rendering. You'll see some familiar images up here. These are some of the things that we've worked with them on, and One API, and in particular Osprey, is their renderer built on top of that. Has been integrated into some of the production tools that we typically use, like Visit and Peer Review, like I mentioned before, right? And so the star image and the blood flow image, along with the pillars and the blood flowing through it, those were actually both rendered using Peer Review and the Osprey backend. So in addition to using it in our tools, industry has adopted it as those tools as well. And so here's a case where we wanted to, again, look at how do we give context to the data that we're looking at. So this is an experiment. On the left side, you see the physical apparatus that's being simulated. And then on the right, there's this fluid dynamics simulation that's looking at the flow that's going on essentially in the cylinder in the middle, right? And so if we just show that cylinder, like in the image on the right, yes, people can understand what's happening, but when you're trying to present this to a lay audience in a much broader sense, it can lose context. And so our goal was to couple the visualization tools that we typically use, like Visit and Peer Review, with commercial tools to extend that that pipeline, and use tools like Maya, Substance Painter, V-Ray. These are tools that are used in cinematic industry. And so we wanted to tie these together. And this is a list of some of the tools that we used. And so sort of an overview of what that pipeline looks like. And again, we're bringing together these tools to look at large scale data, right? And so we want to be able to do this on the visualization cluster supercomputer. We don't want to move terabytes of data to our workstation where typically you would work with these commercial tools. So a little bit of what this process looked like. We would run Peer Review, load the simulation data, and then export geometry. So V-Ray is a commercial renderer that's built on top of the One API. And so we would expect or export the geometry in a format that V-Ray understood, and convert this to a mesh. And then we would move just a couple of time steps of that data to a local workstation where we could then load it into Maya, which is, again, this animation production tool, and use that to load materials, modeling, lighting, right? Give it all that context that it was missing. Add colors to the simulation data. And then we would export that as a scene, VR for V-Ray scene, and it's a format that it knows. Move that scene back to the cluster, where we would then use this scene to be able to say, now we did this for a couple of time steps on the workstation, but now I can just swap out the time steps for all the time steps in the full data set, and in parallel run essentially multiple instances of V-Ray to render different steps of the simulation. Where we're coupling the data with these additional models and textures and everything that we did using the production animation tools. And we didn't have to move terabytes of data to our workstation in order to do it. So at this point, I'm going to hand things over to Silvio to talk about in situ viz and analysis. Any questions for me before? I mean, I'll be around and back, but as we're switching. All right, great.
All right, can people hear me? I guess you can, right? Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks, Joe. I'm Silvio Rizzi. I'm a computer scientist at the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility, and I think I met some of you already during the tour a couple days ago. So, as Joe mentioned, we'll transition now to the concept of in situ viz and analysis. And some of this is motivated and specifically by the need of saving a lot of data, right? So the big simulations are increasing their size. The flops that we have available to those simulations are still increasing, but the I/O is not catching up, right? So the gap is always increasing between flops and I/O. So that's one of the motivations, right? We can't save all the results that we're generating. In this specific slide, we want to show, and this is old, all right? This is actually from Titan. So we've been talking about this for a few years now. Titan was a supercomputer in Oak Ridge National Lab with GPUs, and that was retired a few years ago. So we've been talking about this for some time. The idea here is to show that there's about 5 orders of magnitude from compute to file, right? And in terms of the bandwidth available. And so that gap will keep increasing. What are the problems that we're listing here? Okay, I mentioned already, and it's not possible to save all the data that we're generating. That may lead to lost science, right? If we're taking a snapshot every 100 time steps, we may lose sight of what's going in between, and there may be something happening there, right? If we're sampling every 100, we may be missing something that happens in the middle. We also, energy is another important aspect here, so we don't want to write all the data to disk specifically for saving energy. And so there's this opportunity of doing better science if we have access to the data while the simulation is running, while the data is in memory, right? So if we have access to that to do our basic analysis, there's a huge opportunity there. And this is what we're proposing here, what the community has been proposing here. Remember, in all the tools that Joe and showed before, right, and most of those animations and pictures, those are generated after the fact, after the big simulations and the big campaigns are concluded, right? So we get data from disk, and that is what we call post-hoc vision analysis. But the idea here is to actually do it on the fly while the simulation is running, okay? And so there's a number of frameworks that our community has been developing and that we want to support and that we're aiming at supporting here at ALCF, either on Polaris or Sunspot and Aurora. Okay, so there's a list here. Alpine and Ascent come from the Exascale Computing Project, and we're members of those teams, so we've been helping with that, especially with porting to Aurora. Sensei is another framework coming from the DOE environment, and we're also part of that team, and we've been helping again with deployment and interacting with science teams using it. Peer-review Catalyst already mentioned, and as well as LibSim, which comes with Visit. And there's the last entry in the list is a SmartSim coming from HPE, which is also deployed here. It's been demonstrated in the facility. And we have colleagues that are experts on that. So the idea of showing this list is that if you're going to be users here, or if you are already, and identify the need of doing in situ vision analysis, talk to us, and we'll point you in the right direction, right? We'll help you maybe integrate one of these frameworks in your code so that you can test it and see if it works and if it does what you need, okay? So here's there's some additional details of the all the efforts in situ vision analysis within the Exascale Computing Project. So this picture gives an idea of the whole, how we integrate the different efforts here. So Alpine, as I mentioned, is the project that brings all these technologies together. The idea here is integrating frameworks, technologies, and algorithms that are specifically deployed for in situ vision analysis, right? Ascent is the way of providing those new algorithms. And then there's the software infrastructures that have been around for decades now, which is Visit LiveSim and Peer-review Catalyst. All these technologies are available, and you can use them here at the facility. All this actually builds on VTKM, which is the lower layer that we're showing there. And VTKM tries to leverage accelerators, right? Tries to port the existing visualization algorithms to accelerators and leverage the parallelism and accelerators. Exploit the intranode parallelism. And I have a slide for that. And there's another technology called Cinema here that I will also describe. As I mentioned, Ascent is one of the in situ frameworks there. And what I want to show here essentially is that if you want to use in situ vision analysis in your code, you will need to instrument your code. You will need to add a few lines of code. And the idea in Ascent is that what you add is is lightweight, so you don't add huge libraries to your code, because there's always the worry that they may break your simulation, right? So it tries to be as light as possible, and the calls that you add to instrument your code are very simple, right? Essentially, opening the environment, passing in your MPI global descriptor, and every time step when there's new data, you will publish the data and execute the analysis that you have there, that you have selected, right? So that's essentially the idea. Sensei, similarly, it's an alternative framework developed with DOE funds as well. And the idea here is that you write your analysis once, and then you can swap the backends. So once your code is instrumented, you can select the backend that you will use for analysis. There's the pictures here show a variety of alternatives that you can use, right? So you can use Adios, for example, which is another DOE technology coming from Oak Ridge, to either save your data or move it through the network. You could use C++ if you want to implement your analysis in C++, or Python if that works best for you, or integrate with the existing BIS and then the more common BIS tools like Catalyst and Visit in Purview. Okay? And the final one that I want to show here is SmartSim coming from HPE. And the idea here is that there's a Redis client API and there's a Redis orchestrator that lives in some of the nodes of where you're running your simulation. The data is communicated here, and there's a client API. This is specifically friendly with Python, and so it's good when you want to connect your simulation with learning frameworks for online training and inference. Okay, so we have, as I said, we have colleagues that have demonstrated this already in the facility, and if you're interested, let us know and we'll point you in the right direction. So some of the infrastructures. As I mentioned, VTKM is one of the underlying infrastructures, trying to take advantage of accelerators. As you see, there are multiple layers here. On the top, it's the visualization algorithms that Joe described earlier. And we wanted to make this portable, right? So we want to run this on AMD GPUs, Intel GPUs, NVIDIA GPUs, and all the CPUs available. So you see that there's the lower layer actually shows the different target devices that we have there. And recently in this slide, I actually changed it last night because we have already demonstrated VTKM on Frontier and Sunspot and Aurora. And it's already running with very few issues, so it's almost ready for production. So if you're planning to do simulations, this is a tool that is available to you. One more interesting tool that is part of the ecosystem is called Cinema, and there's an interesting idea here. There was a paper in Supercomputing 2014 proposing this idea. And the main concept here is that if you save files in every time step, you will need a lot of storage. Now, if you do the VIS and convert your data to images, and you can do this VIS, actually there's tools to do the visualization, shooting pictures from different camera angles, so you can rotate your camera and take multiple pictures from different views, and maybe varying parameters. So if you're creating an isosurface, you can vary the parameter that gives you the isosurface, and you get a collection of images for every time step that you can later explore interactively. They have a viewer, they provide a viewer where you can load those databases of images, and you can explore interactively later. Still, saving all those pictures, you save a few orders of magnitude when you compare to the raw data that you will save in every time step, right? So you're reducing the disk usage in a few orders of magnitude when you save images that you can explore later. And that's the main idea and how it's implemented, and it's available again for everyone who wants to explore it. One example of a recent success story, and these are slides from our colleague Victor, who is not here today. NECRS, this is a code that we've been working with for quite some time now, because we have good colleagues here at Argonne driving these efforts. And it's a CFD code, and we have instrumented it with multiple frameworks, but in this case, we're going to demonstrate Ascent, which is the most recent. And so there's a nice contribution here that Victor has been working on, and this is that when the data lives on GPU memory, the data that you're simulating, right? So it lives on GPU memory. Traditionally, if you want to do your analysis in situ, you need to move it to the CPU and move it maybe to another GPU. or do the analysis on the GPU, and there's a cost to pay. You don't want that data movement. So what he implemented is essentially a mechanism for sharing pointers in GPU memory. So the data lives on the GPU memory for the simulation, and the analysis and visualization gets a pointer to that and can use it without memory copy, without those expensive transfers from host, from device to host or host to device. And here's a demonstration on Polaris of an example, and he actually captured NVIDIA SMI running on a single node there, where you can see that it's actually leveraging the 4 GPUs almost at maximum utilization. And the images that you see here are captured in 40 ranks on Polaris running in situ with Ascent. More nice pictures actually provided by the science team experimenting with this integration. And I guess with this, we can move on to wrapping up the session. One thing we can offer is that we have our hands-on session planned for the afternoon. It's going to be in the room here across the hall. And there's a list of things that we can do if you're interested, right? So we can help you set up PeerView if you would like to visualize your data in Polaris. We can help you set up Visit if you would like to visualize your data in Polaris. We can help you with some PeerView scripting. There are multiple ways, and Joe is a wizard with PeerView scripting, so multiple ways of actually exporting the pipeline that you're seeing in PeerView, converting it to Python, and then automate the generation of frames for a movie. So if you're interested in generating movies from your data, we can help you with automating that. We can help you explore your data, again, even if it's your first time doing it. And if you're interested in some of the in situ frameworks, we can also show you the first steps and point you in the right direction. So to finalize, you are users, you are facility users, or you will be, right? But anyone who is a user of the facility, we can help you with all your visualization needs. So if you have any visualization needs, let us know, contact us, and we can help you in multiple aspects, including getting your pictures and getting nice pictures of your science and helping you get them in a cover of a journal or something like that, as we showed in the tour, right? We can help you create animations or nice pictures for your publications, or we can help you with experimenting with the data, exploring the data interactively, right? So there are many things that we can do for you. Let us know what you need. And since you're going to have a copy of the slides, we put links to many of the things we've mentioned through the slides. So here you will find the links for additional information. And with that, we will be happy to take any questions that you may have.
So thank you, Silvio and Joe.
We have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions. So.
I saw the tools and cinematics that you guys are using. Very, very interesting. I was wondering, I didn't see Blender. Is Blender part of the I don't know, repertoire, or?
So, am I back on?
Yeah, you're on.
So, Blender's a perfectly fine tool, and we have done a little bit of stuff with it, but we haven't done a ton. And Houdini is another, if you're familiar with that. So we're starting to experiment more in that space. Certainly, Blender has the advantage that it's open source, and so we have done a little bit with that, but yeah, we haven't done extensive work with it. But it's definitely a viable solution that you could work into the pipeline. for sure.
And in that pipeline that Joe showed, actually, there was Maya there. You could perfectly replace Maya with Blender if you want, right? Or if you're more comfortable using Blender.
Here's another question.
Yeah, we talked about this briefly yesterday, but I just wanted to make sure. So our CFT pipeline will have mixed element, heterogeneous mixed element mesh, and we need to convert that back when we render it on the GPUs into nano VDB or something like it, right? Can we do that fairly easily? I think through VTK, right? We can go from TETs, hex, and pyramids, right, back down to just trying, because it does Anari, you didn't mention Anari here, but is that going to be important for your vision efforts?
So, right, so we didn't mention it specifically. I mean, at least currently, we're not using it directly. We're leveraging the tools that are built with it, like Visit and ParaView and the other, Osprey and all the other renderers that are out there that are leveraging it. So that's sort of the extent of our leveraging of it is through those other tools. But so you mentioned, the need to convert mesh elements. So there is, and I think we talked about this the other day too, is we could potentially use, there's the tetrahedralizer filter in VTK, right? And so that could potentially get, put in the loop. And I don't, you'll have to fill me in if I'm wrong, but it may or may not be leveraged, implemented in VTK-M, the tetrahedralized one. So that will take different mesh elements and essentially turn them all into TETs.
So what I was saying is that if we want to leverage the GPU, right, then the pipeline, if we're going through Unreal, it goes back to their own thing called sparse volume textures. But on the NVIDIA side, we'd have to use nano VDB, right? So that's essentially a hexes.
Right. So so we can talk offline, but the pipeline that we're envisioning, and we touched on it a little bit, was many of the VTK-M, there's a VTK-M implementation on the GPU, right? And so for things like Osprey, they're working on how can you do GPU to GPU memory, right? So do everything on the GPU, simulation and VTK-M for doing any number of the analysis pipeline, and then leverage, for example, Osprey to render all on the GPU without moving on.
So VTK-M is a set of CUDA calls on the GPU that allow me to do things like you're saying, like tetrahedralize or hexahedralize from my
Right. So I don't know. Yes.
Oh, perfect.
The short answer is yes. I don't know if specifically those filters have been implemented there yet, but that's in process for sure.
Okay, thank you. That's perfect.
Coming back to your original question, the example that we're seeing here, right, the NECRS, it's also CFD. The data lives in its own internal representation, but we converted it to unstructured grid in order to visualize it with a center like this. So it needs, sometimes you need converting the mesh and the data into a format that the tools understand. Or sometimes it will be native. It will understand that.
We don't need to run VTK's UI. We just run VTK-M as a library, right? So it's all in situ, like you're saying.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, yes. Correct.
Okay, so any other questions? We have time for a couple more.
No more questions? Thank you. So everyone is invited to join the afternoon session, and if you have any more questions there or things that you would like to explore, we can take a look.
Yes, it's in room 1407.
Correct.
All right. Okay, let's thank Joe and Silvio again.
Thank you.